Dear all, good afternoon from Cyprus. It's another show in the English language that we're going to discuss tonight about nuclear Iran and the ambitions of Israel towards the negotiations in Vienna. With us is a good friend from Israel. It's Dr. Ori Goldberg. That he's very specialized in Iran and in the religions. And tonight we're going to have a very interesting discussion about what's going on at the moment in Vienna, but also what's going on in the region as well. Ori, we are very glad to have you with us tonight.
It's my pleasure to be here, as always.
I was about to make the introduction in Hebrew. I have a friend that he sent me this one, but it was quite difficult actually. So next time I think it's going to be
Next time.
better the introduction in Hebrew. Ori, how is the situation in Vienna at the moment? We have the negotiations, and actually it's more than 2 months that we have the negotiations between Israel, between Iran and United States. There are some sanctions that they've been lifted, but what's actually the goal of these negotiations, and is it a win-win situation? How is moving at the moment?
First of all, it seems to be moving just fine. And I think the best indication is that Israel's Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, spoke today about this agreement as though it is a done deal. It's going to be signed. And basically, what the agreement does is ensure a return to the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which was the official name for this nuclear agreement. This agreement deals exclusively with nuclear issue, and once it's signed, then the lifting of sanctions by the United States will begin, and the United States will return to the agreement. That's a point that's important to remember. It is the U.S. that withdrew from the agreement. The agreement was never canceled or abrogated. The agreement still stands. And the Vienna negotiations were meant to facilitate a return to the original agreement. They took a while because it was politically difficult for both sides to really get into the process. But I think right from the start, it was pretty obvious that both sides are very interested in a deal. In Israel, where there is a general sort of objection to the agreement, there was an attempt to describe the American position as a weak one and the Iranian position as a reluctant one. I think that's really not the case. I think that both the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran were very much interested in returning to full implementation of the JCPOA, and it seems like that's what's going to happen. Uh,
Ori, it's going to be an implementation of the nuclear agreement. To what extent, in northern Iran, to be reintroduced to the international community, or I mean, it's a kind of United States approaching Iran in northern Iran not to become an active agent of China.
good question. The Chinese angle is, let's say, still very subtle. Nothing is actually being, I think, done overtly with regard to China. I don't think that the United States views this agreement as a way to foil Chinese aspirations. I think the United States views this agreement as an attempt to um, create some sort of stability in the Middle East, perhaps because the United States is preparing to move the main focus of its efforts to Asia and the Pacific. But no, I generally think that there is interest on all sides. That is, not just the United States, but the signatory parties to the agreement, the five permanent members of the UN Security Council in Germany, and Iran. There's real interest in reintroducing Iran into the global community gradually, slowly, but much more effectively than it was done the last time.
Do the United States trust Iran in order to be introduced in the international community?
Yeah, I think they do.
Are you
They're
very
not.
optimistic? I think you're very optimistic tonight.
I'm very optimistic generally. I've been accused of excessive optimism. Do I think that the United States trusts Iran? I think the United States is suspicious of Iran. I think that the general attitude towards Iran in the international community has always been one of suspicion. But I think the Americans understand something, as do the Europeans. and that is that the Islamic Republic of Iran really has no other options but to return to full implementation, because the Islamic Republic, the leadership of the Islamic Republic, knows very well that if it isn't able to ensure not just a stable standard of living for Iranian citizens, but an improvement in the standard of living for Iranian citizens, and the Islamic Republic will at some point be brought down by the Iranian public. I think the Americans know that. I think the Europeans know that. I think the Iranians know that. So there is a joint interest on the part of everybody involved to enter into this agreement and to live up to everyone's commitments. Another point I want to make is that last time around, Iran, according to pretty much every intelligence estimate I've ever seen from all intelligence organizations in the world, including Israel's Mossad, last time after the agreement was signed in 2015 until President Trump withdrew from the agreement, Iran lived up to all of its commitments. Iran did everything it was supposed to do according to the agreement. So everybody has some sort of interest um, in doing this, in allowing Iran an opportunity.
So, does Israel has this kind of does it Israel have this kind of interest Iran to return to the
No,
table and
no,
be a part of the international community?
no. Israel doesn't, and Israel's actually made it less of an interest because Israel has, ever since the signing of the Abraham Accords, Israel has become a very faithful member and promoter of the political agenda held by both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Just today, Israel's Minister of Defense, who is at the security conference in Munich, basically declared that Israel was obligated to defend its friends from Iranian and Iranian proxy aggression. We specifically meant the Houthi attacks on the United Arab Emirates and on Saudi targets, and he basically hinted that Israel would sell the Emirates and the Saudis defensive systems. So Israel really doesn't have an interest in Iran joining the global discussion. Another reason that Israel doesn't have this interest is a reason related to domestic politics. Our prime minister currently, Naftali Bennett, has done everything in his power to differentiate himself from the man he replaced, from Benjamin Netanyahu. But there is one area where there is a general, broad, strong consensus in Israeli politics, and that is that Iran is Israel's existential enemy, that it provides an existential threat to Israel's national security, that a lot of money needs to be spent in preparations to ensure that Israel is able to take Iran on should it be forced to do so. And Bennett, who doesn't have terrific statesman credentials, keeps the one place where he does exactly what Netanyahu did is on the Iranian issue. Okay, he continues to say that Israel objects to any sort of agreement with Iran, that Iran cannot be trusted, that while Israel will accept an agreement if it is signed, Israel reserves the right to use its own
Sorry,
means. Yeah.
there was a kind of reapproach last year and probably this year as well between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So Saudi Arabia, there was some rumors that Saudi Arabia is gonna reopen the embassy in all kind of consulate
Hmm.
in Tehran.
Yeah.
But we really see Bin Salman, I mean, Iran returned back to Saudi Arabia on the Islamic organization and the office there.
Yeah.
But we really see that Bin Salman is very reluctant to move on with Iran. Of course, he was reluctant also to move on with Israel and his movie, but he's very cautious of what he's doing. And we see that he's investing, but he's investing most on the west side of the country, which means on the Red Sea. And both Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain also started. They tried to avoid Persian Gulf, which means that they try to isolate Persian Gulf and move on their interest to West. So I try to understand if there is a real interest by the part of Saudi Arabia to improve the relations with Iran.
Hmm. First, you have to remember that it's not just about Saudi Arabia. It's also about the Emirates. And the Emirates and Iran have a flourishing trade relationship. I think they're both each other's largest trade partners. So Iran is fully present in the Gulf and in the Saudi influential sphere. You have to remember also the rivalry between the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis, a rivalry that is expressed in Yemen, expressed across the Gulf. They have different agendas. The ruling families of the Emirates are not big fans of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. They don't appreciate his style. They think he's too much of a showman, that he um, tries to cater to the West. Also, you have to remember that there is a general sense of discomfort in Western capitals with regard to bin Salman. He has not been very successful in promoting his so-called reforms, and where there was once tremendous enthusiasm about him as the person who would lead the kingdom into a new era, he now seems to be mostly focused on domestic politics and on his own squabbles with his half brothers from the other branches of the royal family. So is bin Salman slow to move on Iran? Bin Salman is slow generally, as you said. He doesn't really, he's not really a fan of active direct measures. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that he seems to have an interest in maintaining a relationship with the Iranians. He doesn't want naked hostility. Also, another thing you have to remember about bin Salman, he has this civil war in Yemen where he has involved Saudi Arabia to a tremendous extent. He's spending huge amounts of money there. He's not getting anything for his efforts. He's killing a lot of Yemeni civilians. And the more time passes, the more aware and the more comfortable the world feels in blaming him for a lot of what is happening in Yemen.
Ori,
So,
does Israel have a kind of interest in Yemen at the moment?
no, not so much. I mean, the Israeli press is trying to spin the Houthis as a potential threat. And the Houthis themselves, their spokes their spokesmen sometimes like to go on camera and talk about the Zionist enemy and death to Israel and all that. I don't think that there's any direct interest that Israel has in Yemen. There have been reports of Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah personnel who are assisting the Houthis. Israel, I assume, would have some interest in that. But even if that is happening, it is not the game changer. And really, Israel doesn't have a lot of interest in Yemen, except for the fact that Mohammed bin Salman, who is now considered a good friend here, is very much fully um, stuck there. So it's Israel's interest to help. And again, I want to remind you that Israel's Defense Minister Gantz said in Munich today that Iran is attacking Israel's friends in the Gulf and that Israel will assist its friends. So we don't have any direct interest in Yemen, but we're very much aware of what's happening and we're following the events because we think it gives us a good excuse to become more friendly with the Saudis.
So, Ori, let's say that United States are lifting part of the sanctions against Iran, so Iran slowly is moving back to the normality, which means to be reintroduced to the international community. Probably we're going to have flights, so we're going to have some trade relations. Of course, this that goes so far away because United States they're not going to implement one-way sanctions to lift the sanctions, which means that they will give some air to Iran to breathe before they start controlling all activities of Iran. The point is that what is Iran wants to do? I mean, does Iran want to be established as a nuclear power? Do they use nuclear power for peaceful reasons, like Turkey, as alleged by Turkey in IQ? So, what are the plans of Iran for this nuclear program? I mean, I am a
Mm-hmm.
researcher of Iran, but tell you the truth, there are two things about Iran nuclear program and Persian Gulf that I have no interest. I mean, I find them things that they are going one day they are going to have soon, a kind of end.
Um, there are a lot. I think there are several directions where we can take an answer to your very good question. Um, One is sort of a symbolic political direction. Iran's nuclear program, in the eyes of most Iranians now, even those who don't support the Islamic Republic, is a symbol of national honor. The nuclear program is both a deterrent, mostly against Israel, and you have to remember that in Iranian eyes, Israel is not just a potential aggressor, but a very, very powerful country that talks constantly about a strike on Iran. And also, you have to remember another thing: if you consume Western media and Israeli media, it's a thing that you could potentially forget, but it's a very important point. Israel has a nuclear arsenal. According to most qualified reports and sources, Israel has several hundred nuclear weapons ready to be launched from various platforms, including fighter planes, submarines, missiles. Iran. So, in Iranian eyes, Israel is a major aggressor, and Iran needs a nuclear program to serve as a deterrent against potential Israeli aggression. That's one way to think about it. Remember, another way is the symbol. The world persecutes Iran and Iranian policy because of this nuclear program. This nuclear program is a sign that Iran and Iranians are truly citizens of the world and are capable of entering the family of the most developed nations. Remember that a nuclear program and even a military nuclear program both serve as a sign of the sophistication and advanced qualities of whatever country's technological capabilities. Another reason is really the hostilities in the Middle East. Iran understands itself to be isolated in a very, very hostile region that includes not just Israel, its potentially existential enemy, but also a huge ocean of Arabs who have disliked Iranians and have had Iranians dislike them for a very, very long time. And the nuclear program serves for Iran exactly the needs that it serves for many other countries that aspire to such a program. It places them at the status of, at the very least, regional powers, and it gives them a lot of room, a lot of leverage to maneuver and to gain influence. That is not to say that the usual allegations against Iran about regional hegemony, I think, are very founded, but Iran needs to have a very strong card up its sleeve in order to consider itself safe, in order to understand its national security
Of
doctrine
course,
as effective.
sorry, there is the other way around that of Arabs, they do consider Iran that is not a peaceful power, and they consider, especially with the Shia
Hmm.
terminology and theology, that is dividing Arabs, and it's totally involved in the politics of a lot of Arabic countries, especially in Iraq. The
Hmm.
last 10 years, that we see that though there is a U.S. occupation, most of the governments that they've been raised there, they are apparently
For
Shia
a very, very long time.
and pro-Iranians, though there is a U.S. occupation. We have Al-Meri, and we have also Al-Maliki. Then especially Al-Maliki several times said that I'm first Shia and then I'm Iraqi, saying
Hmm.
that he's working under the umbrella of Iran. So how does Iran is going further to the politics of in a region that is claiming from the one side that I am against imperialism, against United States, but from the other side, in a place like Iraq, we see that the last 10 years, most of the governments that they've been elected or raised there, or they came up, they are Shia and pro-Iranian.
Huh. Um, Again, I think perhaps the best way to answer your question is to say that there are different voices inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. Generally, I think that you can talk about the leadership of the Islamic Republic as being united on one hand because they are now the national elite and they have a lot to lose if the Islamic Republic is going to be um, destabilized or potentially brought down by popular revolution. But there are also deep divisions within the leadership of the Islamic Republic. There is still that there's a sizable camp that understands. Let me put it this way: the difference of opinion is about how to secure the future of the Islamic Republic. One party basically says that the future of the Islamic Republic is fully dependent on cooperation with the world, on presence in the world, on being able to take part in regional processes and in global processes, on opening up Iran's very talented, very well um, educated workforce to the world and to the region. And there is another party within the leadership of the Islamic Republic that sees Iran's future in maintaining a constant revolutionary pose. That is, maintaining a fairly, I don't, I suppose, a hostile relationship or I guess, a conflict based relationship with the region. That is not to say seeking war, but seeking direct influence and being very present, being involved in domestic politics in different countries around the region. These two parties within the leadership are constantly conducting a discrete battle for over the future of the Islamic Republic. I think that now these two parties are coming together to some extent because while the more conflictual conservatives are in power now, they seem to be the ones actively enforcing the agenda of the more liberal party, the party that looks to the world. So right now, it all seems to be converging on a single agenda, and the agenda is to reintroduce Iran into the world. That doesn't mean that Iran is going to abandon its policies of direct presence and influence in the Middle East. Iran is very much concerned with what is happening in Iraq, as you said. Its immediate neighbor, it's concerned with the Shia community there. It has very, very viable, very real interests in Lebanon. It has a real interest in fighting jihadism, Sunni jihadism in the region. So all of these things are going to continue, but I expect that the signing of the agreement will strengthen those in Iran who understand that the most pressing challenge the Islamic Republic has is a domestic challenge, is in creating a better life for Iranians, is in allowing more Iranians to prosper economically, and to hope that if they're able to do that, those Iranians will continue to support the Islamic Republic, and we won't
Um,
see the seeds of a popular revolution.
Only this is the most, let's say, regulatory process that needs to be followed in these negotiations. Why then is Israel so against this agreement? And actually, there are a lot of news that came up lately, the last 48 hours, that there are Israeli delegations in Vienna,
Mm-hmm.
and they try to discuss also this with the United States. So, or probably there is a kind of channel that is opening between Iran and Israel, unofficially, of course, in the way that it was before the war of 2006 between Israel and Lebanon.
Hmm.
So, what is the situation? I mean, why Israel doesn't want this agreement to be moved, and what is Israel doing at the moment in Vienna?
Israel isn't doing much in Vienna at the moment. This is a last minute effort to, after Israel has basically become, after the Israeli authorities have basically grown convinced that Americans will, the American position will not change, that the Americans are eager to return to an agreement, that the Americans will not demand a new agreement, that they're eager to begin lifting sanctions and give Iran a chance to prove its seriousness in real time. Israel decided to send a fairly senior but still professional delegation led by the deputy director for strategy of Israel's foreign ministry. And this delegation, it did take a meeting with the American team to the Vienna negotiations, but mostly it met with the high ranking officials of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, which sits in Vienna. And Israel presented all sorts of evidence to the IAEA about past violations that Iran carried out um, regarding Iran's duties according to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, by the way, Iran has signed, but Israel has not. The Israeli delegation to Vienna is mostly an attempt to grab some headlines. It hasn't been able to do anything of significance, and I think Israeli authorities knew that to begin with. Why doesn't Israel want this agreement? Well, Israel doesn't want this agreement uh, because Israel is dependent. Israel's security establishment, defense establishment, is dependent on the existence of Iran as an existential enemy. That's not to suggest that Iran isn't a real enemy of Israel, but the Israeli defense establishment under Netanyahu has become addicted to the
So
Iranian.
it was mostly for a personal benefit of Netanyahu. This kind of, I mean, saying that Iran is a kind of enemy of Israel, because I remember that it was a kind of also statements by Mossad at that time, not
Mhm,
by Yossi, but by
mhm,
someone, by some of the Mossad guys saying that we don't see Iran as an existential threat of Israel.
mhm. Yes, most of before Yossi Cohen, the former director, the director of Mossad, Israel's army chief of staff, directors of Shin Bet, the entire Israeli defense establishment came out and said directly that they did not view Iran as an existential threat. This was an attempt to stop discussions about an Israeli strike on Iran, discussions that were initiated, sorry about the moving, discussions that were initiated by Prime Minister Netanyahu and his then Defense Minister Ehud Barak. I don't want to suggest that this is for the personal gain of Netanyahu. Viewing Iran as an existential threat is, I think, an ideological, political position that has some validity. I mean, after all, when you look at the Iranian rhetoric, when you look at Iranian involvement with organizations that directly target Israel, when you look at Iranian proxies that are thriving in countries that surround Israel, when you look at the relationship that Iran has with the Palestinian Hamas and with the Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip, Iran is an enemy of Israel, and Israel is an enemy of Iran. But the general, I guess I can call it, obsession with Iran is certainly a political pose. It's not a lie. It's a legitimate political position, but it's certainly a position held for political purposes, and it is an alliance between, or it was an alliance between Netanyahu and the defense establishment. The defense establishment did not necessarily approve of Netanyahu, as is evidenced by those statements that you described, by the heads of Israel's defense organizations basically saying Iran is not an existential enemy. But because Netanyahu decided that it was, Netanyahu provided tremendous budgets. I mean, we're talking billions and billions of shekels over the last 15 years or so to ensure that Israel is ready for an Iranian offensive, that Israel is able to foil Iran's nuclear plans, and in a sort of a discreet way, even when the heads of the defense establishment took Netanyahu on, they criticized him publicly, they were still very much allied with him. They wanted those budgets. They wanted a clearly defined enemy. Israel, Israeli defense policy is not in particularly good situation at the moment. Israel is the situation in the Palestinian territories is deteriorating. Israel is finding it very difficult to maintain its almost 55-year-old
Ori,
occupation.
is there any kind of connection between Iran and the Arab groups in the Palestinian territories?
Iran provides some finance to Palestinian Hamas. And if you listen and take in Israeli media, they will have you believe that Hamas is an Iranian proxy. It is not. Iran is involved to some extent in directing a much smaller organization called the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which works in the Gaza Strip. But the Iranian relationship with Hamas is tenuous and strained and somewhat ambivalent. They get some Iranian financing. It is far from being an Iranian proxy. Generally speaking, Iran doesn't have a great deal of influence in the Palestinian territories.
There
Um,
was a kind of I think it was a Poe Institute that there was a kind of search for results, and I think after a kind of research, it's been said that 55 of the Palestinians, they don't really want an involvement of Iran in their issues, in their affairs.
Iran is not significantly involved in the Palestinian territories. Is not significantly involved in Palestinian politics. Iran tries to use its influence to constantly provoke and potentially threaten Israel. And again, I said Palestinian Hamas in Gaza does receive some Iranian financing, but the relationship is quite tumultuous. It's not a particularly close relationship. Iran is a player, but it is in many ways not a very significant player in what is happening. Palestinians certainly don't want Iranian involvement. To the best of my knowledge, most Sunni Arabs in the Middle East don't want Iranian involvement. I think the Iranians know this, and Iranian attempts to maintain influence in the region are very far from the descriptions you can hear in Israeli media and in some American and European media about Iran's octopus like desire for hegemony. To the best of my knowledge, that is not the case. Iran understands its basic position in the Middle East to be a defensive one, not an offensive one. Iran is always preparing for a strike against itself, and it wants to create the power to retaliate in very convincing fashion. But as far as I can tell, Iran doesn't have any clearly defined offensive plans to take over the Middle East.
So it's kind of not territorial expansion, but you see it's political and culturally influenced that Iran still wants to be a significant player
Mhm.
without really having any military uh, expenses on that.
I don't think Iran most definitely doesn't want to fight wars.
But in any
Iran,
way, worry, Iran doesn't fight any wars, which means
yeah,
that if we go to Syria, for example, is the Nabiyun or some brigades that they come from Afghanistan, and especially what we have seen, because I saw that, and it was extremely funny after point. And then there are big trucks that they
mhm,
carry dead bodies, and these dead bodies of Pakistanis and Afghans, they are not buried in Syria because Iran doesn't want to leave any evidences that I use this kind of proxies in Syria. So actually,
mhm.
they take them back to Iran, but not even back to Iran. Sometimes they just let the bodies somewhere in Iraq, and when they go to Iran, they just make a big grave, group grave, and they say it's 100 people that they died for the Islamic Republic or for Mahdis. So in any case, Iran doesn't really fight in any wars. It has a lot of, let's say, supporters, but also a lot of mercenaries, like a lot of other states do.
I agree. In that sense, there's a resemblance between Iranian policy and Russian policy when it comes to fighting abroad. Lots of mercenaries, Shia mercenaries, brigades that are brought in through the influence of the Revolutionary Guard and their international presence. The best of my knowledge, you're right. Iran invests a lot of money in its foreign involvement schemes, but the
There was, sorry I interrupt you, there was a kind of statement by Zarif that he was taking an interview by a journalist from Afghanistan. So he even invited him. He said to him, if you are not happy with your salary, you can fight for Iran in Syria, and you
yeah.
can be one of us. So I think that even from Zarif's perspective, though I'm not a big fan of his political ideas, I think that he exposed the way that Iranian foreign policy in this perspective is moving.
Yeah, I think you're right. And again, another point I want to stress is that as far as the leadership of the Islamic Republic goes, this foreign involvement is the prerogative of the Revolutionary Guard. That is, leadership doesn't really. This isn't an effort that comes from a united leadership. Okay, the Revolutionary Guards. This is whatever happens outside Iran is their fief, is their realm. They control it. They make a lot of money out of it, and they are allowed to continue their escapades abroad. But at the same time, their presence inside Iran, to some extent, is more limited than it once was. And this is the permission that they get to pursue their agendas abroad is kind of a compensation for their diminished presence inside Iran. So again, a lot of this stuff is about Iranian politics, right? Much less than some sort of universal ideological campaign to bring Iranian influence in the Middle East to defend the Shia or whatever it is Iran is usually accused of doing. This is to a great extent about domestic politics within the Islamic Republic and not so much about Iran's master plan to take over the region.
What good is when it comes to the internal politics? How do Iranians see all these provisions that the state gives to the army? For example, Iran, it has a army in-house, Artesh, and they have also the guardians that goes outside the borders. But I have seen a kind of financial, let's say, situation, and I mean, the last decades there were some trillions invested in the guardians abroad Iran, and a few, just a few billions inside for the educational and health system. How do Iranians understand this kind of imbalance between the army expenses and the in-house reforms that they are
They
putting
understand. I think Iranians understand very well the basic split at the heart of the regime. By the way, no, this isn't unique to the Islamic Republic. It's something that happens in every revolutionary movement, and that is after the initial success of the revolution, you sort of have to decide where the future lies. And there are always the people who are purists who have a lot to gain from maintaining a revolutionary attitude. That is, remaining hostile to everybody outside the revolution, that is, maintaining a very centralized power structure, providing the small elite with almost absolute authority. These are people who want to continue the revolutionary stance, who say the only hope we have of succeeding in the future is to remain revolutionaries. And on the other side, there are always people, again, every revolutionary movement who say that's exactly wrong. The reason we had the revolution in the first place is to bring about change. Now, we undertook the sacrifice and the ordeal of the revolution itself so we can, once the revolution succeeds, bring stability, bring prosperity, not necessarily democracy by any means, not necessarily liberalism or more humane policies, but prosperity and stability. And that's exactly the battle that's being waged in Iran right now. It has been waged for, I guess, at least 15 or 20 years. The guardians, revolutionary guards, people who act abroad, they are people who think Iran's future lies in revolution, in constant revolution, in maintaining a hostile position towards the world at large, and understanding that Iran is and always will be isolated. And against them, in contrast to them, there are the people who, oh, sorry, contrast to them, there are the people who will focus, who feel that the Islamic Republic must provide a better future, more stable, prosperous future, and these are the people who want Iran to rejoin the world. That's basically
Um,
the battle.
Already, there was a kind of discussion. We had a kind of discussion a few months ago. Some journalists and people from the military in Cyprus and in Greece, and we were discussing about Iran
Mhm.
with a lot of diplomats from the ministries in
Mhm.
Cyprus and Greece. So we're discussing about that Iran it's supposed to be reintroduced to the international community and follow this kind of relations. But
Mhm.
there was a kind of discussion and a very good question. Does Iran want to belong to West? Does Iran is preferred to the politics of in the region that is claiming from the one side that I am against imperialism, against United States, but from the other side, does Iran want to belong to West?
Hmm. Does Iran want to belong to the West? I don't think Iran wants to belong to the West. I think the Iranians understand themselves to be, well, traditionally, ever.
Are they unique?
Well, they think of themselves as unique. In that sense, they're very much like Israel, and they are unique. They're not Arabs. They're Shia. Racially speaking, ethnically speaking, they're not Semites, and again, not Arabs, not Sunnis.
A part of Iran is they are Semites.
Well, that's
They are
true,
Arabs.
but the general ethos of Iran, of the Islamic Republic, I mean, the dominance is a Persian dominance. Um, I don't think they want to belong to the West. I think Iran has always considered itself to be unique, and I think Iran wants what I guess could be called the respect it thinks it deserves. I think Iran sees itself as, at the very least, a regional power. It thinks that it has been wronged, not
Maybe
just.
do you have the maybe they over appreciate themselves?
You could say that pretty much about everybody. You could certainly say that about Israel. Does Israel overappreciate itself? A lot of people would claim that it does.
Certainly it does.
A lot of people
Of
would claim
course
that
it
it
does.
does. Very few countries that I know hold themselves in reasonable esteem. Most countries excessively appreciate themselves. The Iranians do so as well, but again, you have to remember that for the Islamic Republic that has been in existence for, do we celebrate what, 43 years now? 42? I always forget. At the beginning of February, I think it was 43 years.
It's for 33 years.
Yeah, so the Islamic Republic celebrated 43 years, and for all of its 43 years of existence, um, it has considered itself to be wrongfully and maliciously treated by the world at large. Okay, a lot of Iranian pride is about how the world doesn't understand Iran, how the world wrongly accuses Iran, how the world sees Iran as an aggressor. Um, Having said that, while the Iranians really think a lot of bad things about the world's attitude towards Iran, Iran definitely sees itself as a part of the world. It always has. And in that sense, it's very different from, say, Saudi Arabia, okay, that wants to promote its very specific agenda, but really doesn't want the world to have any influence on it except on its own very specific terms. Iran has always been much more worldly than pretty much every Arab country in the Middle East. And while it has always thought of itself as unique, it has always thought that the proper place for this uniqueness is the world. Okay? Not just the region, not just Persian speaking countries. Iran has always seen itself as a world power. Definitely.
Or how do you see and how do you understand this kind of turn that Iran is reapproaching Azerbaijan, and at the same moment it tries to keep the balance with Armenia?
I think that's very much in character with Iran's foreign policy. I think the Iranians I think that their main goal is stable, successful influence. And that means that if I had to characterize Iran's foreign policy in three words, I would say influence, not decision. Iran doesn't want to defeat anybody, not because it's liberal or because it loves peace, but because it considers its national security to be dependent on an ongoing, continuous ability to exercise active influence over events in Iran's environment. If you are focused on mm, defeating your enemy, on a clearly defined decision where your side wins and the enemy loses, if that happens, then you lose stable influence. You're not able to exercise stable influence. I mean, think about Lebanon, for example. Okay, I mean, Lebanese Hezbollah could have actively taken over Lebanon several times over the last 15 years. It has refrained from doing so. Why has it refrained from doing so? Because Hezbollah, just like its Iranian mentors, doesn't want direct control. It understands that direct control brings a lot more liability than it does
Of
potential
course,
and
that
benefit.
that means liability and of course responsibility. And
I don't
yes,
know. I think the Iranians are very much aware of the tremendous limitations that would be placed on them if they were to assume direct responsibility over Arab countries in the Middle East. I mean, I don't think that's why. By the way, I find the whole theory about the Iranian desire for hegemony to be very far fetched. Iranians aren't stupid. They understand that no self-respecting Sunni Arab country would ever accept Iranian overt Iranian dominance. So the Iranians want to exercise backroom influence. They very much actively refrain from assuming direct control. And I think, rightfully, I think they're very smart about this. They understand that the greatest potential lies in influence rather than decision. And that's what they've been doing. They're very active in the region. They're very much players. They try to advance their own agenda. I'm not suggesting that they are passive or overly respectful of other countries' rights, but the way they do it is the important part. They do it through
only
influence.
I mean, when we say about agenda, how does Iranian foreign policy understand the policy of Assad regime regarding the Golan Heights?
I don't think Iranians are terrifically, or are you referring to these what I understand completely fictitious stories about Iran's plan to settle Shia in the Golan Heights? I understand that there are conspiracy theories being floated that that is what the Iranians are doing. The best of my understanding, that's just completely untrue. Not only is there no proof, but it makes absolutely no sense to do such things. I think people, certainly in Israel, there are a lot of people like that, but not exclusively. People around the world who want to draw attention to Iran's policy, who want to understand Iran's policy as combative, as a policy that is waiting for the day when Iran will actively take over the Middle East. These people will say that the Iranians are pushing the Assad regime to basically make the Syrian Golan Heights, a garrison in preparation for the upcoming war against Israel. The best of my knowledge, Israel's defense establishment isn't it does not consider the current Syrian policy in the Golan to be an active, immediate threat to Israel. As far as they understand, I mean, Israel is planning to expand its presence in the Golan Heights, not just militarily, but civil settlements as well. But I don't think, as far as I know, Israel, I mean, is very active in Syria. It bombs targets, it carries out commando operations, but the best of my knowledge, Israel doesn't see a real threat of war coming from Syria, either from the Assad regime or from Iranian forces. I don't think that's
Is
accidental.
is Hezbollah a real threat to Israel?
No, I mean, just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, a small unmanned Hezbollah aerial vessel entered Israel airspace and apparently made it back to Lebanon as well. That caused a bit of a stir in Israel. Israeli combat fighters were scrambled and flew over Beirut in a show of concern. The leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, spoke about this unmanned aerial vehicle and basically said that Hezbollah now knows how to enter Israeli airspace. Israelis were, again, quite upset about this for less than a day. Of course, most Israelis either aren't aware or feel very much vindicated in the fact that Israeli fighter planes violate Lebanese airspace on a daily basis. Israel conducts aerial operations in Lebanon without any sort of reserve. So the fact that Hezbollah can now use an unmanned aerial vehicle and have it cross Israel's borders is a development that's to be expected. But to the best of my knowledge, none of this is being carried out in preparation for war. If I understand correctly, Hezbollah very eagerly does not want war, is not interested in war. The Lebanon situation is very bad. Hezbollah understands its future to be intimately connected to Lebanon's future. And the last thing the Lebanese want right now is a war with Israel. I think Israel doesn't want a war either, but the general discourse is always very charged. If I can add a positive development, there are uh, as yet unconfirmed reports of an agreement between Israel and Lebanon that will be reached about the maritime border, which has implications on gas production. And if this
Yeah, or
agreement is
Levant,
if
exactly.
if this agreement is reached, then it will be supported by Hezbollah, and that's another sign that all sides want stability.
Well, yeah. Ori, we have the last two questions for tonight that they come from the audience. One of our friends is asking, how do the Israelis see the destruction of the Beirut port that occurred in 2020?
Mhm.
Because there was a kind of solidarity from the part of Israel. They we remember that there were some lights on Tel Aviv town hall
City Hall,
with
yeah.
the flag of yeah, with the flag of Lebanon. But from the other part, there are people that they say in analysis that they say that was a kind of distraction that occurred by United States and Israel because it's a big competitor of Haifa port, and it
Hmm.
was also the exit of Iran-China agreement. And we see, I mean, last this year there was also a kind of bombing of striking of the Latakia port by Israeli forces. So, how do Israelis see? How did Israelis see the destruction of Beirut port?
Well, interestingly, I think this was one of the first instances I know where Israelis were interested in such a destructive event in the Arab world from a human interest point of view. I think Israelis generally understand how bad the situation in Lebanon is, and there was certainly a show of concern, mostly utilized for, again, domestic political needs. Tel Aviv is Israel's most progressive city, and a show of empathy with Beirut served the agenda of Tel Aviv's longstanding mayor. But yes, there was a general interest in Israel. There were some conspiracy theories about, again, as you said, Israeli responsibility for the bombing, not so much because of the competition with the Haifa port, but because reportedly there were huge Hezbollah ammunition dumps below the port. So there were lots of stories about potential Israeli involvement. None of this was ever proven. I don't know if that was the case. Um, there's been a joke in Israel since the 1950s that no matter what Arab country signs a peace agreement first with Israel, the second country will be Lebanon. There's a general
Yeah, it's true.
understanding.
That's very true.
Yeah, there's a general understanding that the Lebanese should have an interest.
I think Aoun, when I met the Iranian foreign minister a few months ago,
Hmm.
and he didn't agree to the reconstruction of the port by Iranian companies and by the Iranian state. It
Hmm.
was obvious that Aoun wants Lebanon to follow the kind of normalization up to a point with the Gulf countries.
Hmm. I don't think Aoun has the political capital to allow Iranians to again
Yes,
rebuild the
true.
port, but Israelis were concerned and were able to think about for a second to think about Lebanon again not as an enemy country but as a place where actual human beings live. That took about 2 or 3 days, and after that, the public discussion in Israel by most of the Israeli media commentators returned to how Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy and how all the protests in Lebanon are exclusively directed against Iranian presence. And I think if you would ask Israelis now about the explosion in Beirut port, a great many of them would not even remember that it happened. So I wouldn't place too much emphasis on Israeli sympathy and solidarity. It was there, There was potential. There was an offer of assistance from Defense Minister Gantz. I don't know if it was a genuine offer. If it would have been a genuine offer, it would probably have been made discreetly. So I think most of this solidarity that you saw from Israeli politicians was for political needs.
So, last question for tonight, Dori.
Mm-hmm.
Do is the I mean, having Israelis in Vienna, do they try to open an unofficial channel to with the Iranians, and from the other part, how the new allies of Israel that they come from the Gulf countries see this kind of a potential, let's say, unofficial approach?
Again, remember that the Gulf countries themselves are having very official negotiations and discussions with the Iranians. Certainly the Emirates, but the Saudis have announced a new round of talks as well. So, I mean, Israel is very much aware that its new friends are hostile to the Iranians, but are also very much in cahoots in many ways with the Iranians. Um, is there an unofficial channel between Israel and Iran? I don't know of any such channel. I highly doubt that there is. Currently, politically speaking, domestically, both in Iran and in Israel, I doubt that there is any sort of political will or capital that would allow for such negotiations. Is there potential for Israeli Iranian conversation? Certainly. Certainly. I mean, the similarities are great. The basic strategic situation is very similar in many ways. The links between Judaism and Shia Islam are almost uncanny. There's a lot to talk about. Remember that Iran and Israel were best friends up until the revolution of 1979. I don't think any of this is happening now. Is there potential for this? Would it serve both Iranian and Israeli interests? Certainly. Will it happen anytime in the foreseeable future? I don't know. I certainly hope that there are secret channels being opened. I don't think that's the case.
Ori, thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's always a pleasure because we hear another voice about the Israeli foreign policy towards Iran, and all the time we learn new things about Iran. It's very nice because we had a lot of questions by our friends, and a lot of the questions that I asked were coming by our friends, and it's very nice that people that are still interested in the relations of both countries. We wish you a pleasant evening from Cyprus. We are going to see us soon anyway and
Thank you.
discuss about the things.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm very happy to come back whenever you have me.
Excellent. So next week we are going to be with you on Sunday at 9 o'clock in the evening. We are going to have with us a friend that she's a Greek Muslim woman, and we're going to discuss about the role of and the position of women in Islam. And we're going to discuss not only about Shia and Sunnis, but also we're going to discuss about Islam away from dogmas and how new people that are converted to Islam, but they try not to follow any kind of doctrine and dogma, but to follow only what is coming out of the mouth of the Prophet and be undogmatic Muslims. I think already that you teach religions is very unique topic for you as well.
Yep, very unique. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, because when it's been kept to us and we were very interested, and we didn't know actually that a lot of people they follow these non-dogmatic approaches to Islam, and they don't prefer to follow to be Sunni or Shia, but to be undogmatic and follow only the Quran and the rituals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sounds very, very interesting. I'd be happy to watch that.
Yes, we will try to have it in English because we receive a lot of interest from the people abroad as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be a good chance for all of us to be informed about recent developments in Islam as well. Ori, once again, thank you very much for tonight. Thank you everybody for being with us this evening as well, and we will see each other next Sunday at 9 o'clock Cyprus Greek time. Thank you very much. Good night.